Good morning, and thank you for being here. We're gathered on the territory of the signatories of Treaty 6, and I acknowledge the Métis people who share a deep connection with this land. A report from the Alberta Ombudsman is now public on an investigation into the unfair regulations that assess intellectual capacity in order to qualify for the Persons with Developmental Disabilities program. We call it PDD. When a person with disabilities is going through multiple appeals in their application to receive the supports they need, Albertans should be paying attention. There are clear barriers for individuals to access proper supports, and this was something the previous NDP government was going through to properly sort out and address so that Albertans with disabilities could be better supported or have access to the supports they need. And this work stopped immediately under the UCP. This report is troubling, and sadly it's not the last one of its kind that we will see under this UCP government. So today I'm calling for the Minister to fully accept the recommendations from the Ombudsman report and to start meaningful conversations and consultation with Albertans prior to the review of the regulations in the fall. Albertans with disabilities deserve a government who is fully invested in increasing supports and removing all barriers. So I thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, we'll start with questions in person.
Hi, Janet French from CBC. So your party was the government during 4 of the years after the 2013 court decision, which pointed to some of the flaws in this regulation. So when this developmental disabilities regulation, when did your government review that regulation, and why was it not changed at that time?
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. So you're right. So 10 years ago, we did get the court decision that was very clear in saying that the legislature that passed the Act, the Persons with Developmental Disabilities legislation, they did not mean for that legislation to allow bureaucracies or processes to eliminate eligibility based solely on IQ scores. So that was very clear 10 years ago. So when we formed government in 2015, it took a little time to get going, but one of the first things that happened is we identified some of the major barriers in PDD. One of the first things we needed to do was to look at the safety standards. So there was a consultation group put together quickly in 2017. We traveled the province. We had a really unique consultation with self-advocates, service providers, and of course their allies. And we were able to successfully make those changes into safety standards. Now, why those were important was this legislation that had been brought in, or these rules brought in by the previous government, wanted to impose rules on group homes, even for like 2 people living together, that would look like long-term care facilities. So they were really onerous in terms of investment and oversight. So we had that moved. The next thing that we needed to look at, and we learned specifically from this consultation, were the other requirements or eligibility requirements for PDD, number 1 being the IQ score. And so again, we started that work. It was round 2 of the consultation. I think that got going in 2018 into 2019, and of course the recommendations were there around using like the DSM-5 for, we know that it is not appropriate to solely use IQ test scores to assess the needs of someone with an intellectual disability or a developmental disability. So we knew that, we were ready to do that work and progress, and as you can imagine, that would change the face of PDD, that program. So we were ready to do that work, make those investments. As you know, there was an election in 2019, we lost, and that work stopped.
Okay, just to follow up, we spoke to the auditor this morning who said it wasn't just the Zanari family who experienced this, that he'd heard from 4 other families, that office had heard from 4 other families within the last several years. What do you know about the scale of this problem, of this IQ test alone being a barrier to accessing the supports?
That's a really great question. So I can't give you a specific number, but I know 4 is just a drop in the bucket. There are hundreds, if not thousands of people, of Albertans that are denied disability supports because of an IQ score. That has been the case for many, many years. PDD is an old system. It's been around for a very long time. There are many pieces of this program that need to be updated and simply have not been updated. Certainly the IQ score, the reliance on an IQ score is a perfect example of that. Now, I think there have been years where there have been assessors making those decisions that were a little bit more willing to look at the other issues that come into play when you're looking at eligibility. So that would be the daily living skills abilities. So they maybe have made decisions based on not so much IQ. Maybe someone scored a couple points over 70, so they took other things into account. What it looks like now under this current UCP government is they are being very strict. They are adhering to the to every single line in regulation, and they are making decisions that ultimately comply with the rules the way they are written, which are wrong. They comply with the rules, but they are not in the best interest of Albertans. So we know that populations with labels like autism spectrum disorder or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are very vulnerable when it comes to doing well on a test, maybe scoring a little higher on an IQ test, but we know when you look at their ability to manage in the real world, to manage employment, to manage home living, budgeting, banking, personal care, we know that they struggle, and they are disproportionately represented in the justice system and also in acute care. So we know there's a real cost to not fixing this problem.
And Catherine Gurkowski, Alberta Today. So the next review is supposed to be in September 2024. The Ombudsman said he's optimistic that they will make some of the changes. What do you think of the timeline, the review? When does this need to change?
Well, I think it's a cop-out that the government is saying we're going to wait till September 2024. That's only when the regulation expires. They can fix that today, and they need to fix it today. They should have fixed it last year. They should have fixed it 5 years ago, actually. But it needs to be fixed as soon as possible, and I think waiting until September, when they can fix it now, they know there's a problem. They've known for a very long time there's a problem. I think I would urge the government to accept both of the recommendations made by the Ombudsman. One is very personal to Evan. The second one is more system related, and I encourage them to take care of things ASAP.
And on that recommendation related to Evan, the deputy minister rejected it outright, saying they're not going to relook at that. I mean, is there any reason that a government would not reopen that application, or what do you think's going on there?
Well, I can't guess why they wouldn't do it, but what that says to me is that they are not focused on the well-being of Albertans, and they are inflexible. I think we have seen, I've been in this role for a few years now, and I have watched as people have gone through eligibility for PDD, and maybe they didn't quite meet the IQ requirement, but they were certainly able to demonstrate through other assessment that they could not function without support because of the level of disability. And they were approved and they went through. There are many, many examples of that. I know lots personally. So the fact that they're being this strict on eligibility that is clearly inappropriate tells you something about the level of cruelty and the inability of this government to look ahead and say, if we invest a bit now, it's going to save us a little bit later. So once again, this is a government that is not governing for all Albertans, and is certainly not governing with the evidence that has been put right in front of them for many years saying you need to fix this.
Any other questions in person? All right, we'll move to questions on the phone. Just a reminder for those joining us on Zoom to use the raise hand function, and for those on the phone to use *9. Our first question online comes from Michelle Bellefontaine, CBC. Go ahead, Michelle, your line is open.
Right, yeah, okay. So the Ombudsman report says that the regulation was reviewed 3 times over the last decade. And I'm wondering why, you explained the NDP part of it, but I'm wondering why you think that it's been looked at, but no changes have been made. Because the same issues were identified in a court case a decade ago, so it's not unknown to the government what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question, and this is one case where the solutions are very clear. I think the problem is enacting the solutions, and so you need the time. And what we believed as an NDP government is that you need to take the time to consult and get it done properly. So you don't amend legislation and then go back and say, did we get it right? We already knew IQ was a problem, but there are other problems in this eligibility for this particular program that needed to be fixed. So we wanted to take the time to get it done. I'm sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. What was the last part of your question, Michelle? Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to know, where do you think the reluctance is on the part of the government to change the regulation, even though it's been reviewed several times in the last decade?
Right. So if I had to speculate, which is what I'm going to do, is I would suggest the reluctance is money. And so we know that there are thousands and thousands of Albertans who are over the age of 18 who are, whether they're on the autism spectrum or they have FASD or some other diagnosis, but their IQ is above 70. They don't qualify. If we change this eligibility requirement, that would be an influx of thousands of people, and naturally the cost would go up. We already know that this program, if you meet eligibility, you are required to receive the supports. We already know there's a huge wait list. It's over $1 billion of a program, so there is certainly a reluctance to inflate that cost. I would suggest that short-term thinking, because when you invest in people early enough, you're going to prevent some other costs. Now, the other strange thing is that we don't see the same criteria for the children's side of disability support. So from 0 to 18, you don't see this IQ requirement. You only see it after 18. And so you've got a government that's investing in 0 to 18 with early intervention supports, with OT supports, physio, all kinds of things, and then at 18 it stops. And then what? And then you end up with more people in the justice system, more people in acute care. So it's a short-sighted decision. It certainly doesn't meet the needs of Albertans, and I urge this government to make some changes immediately.
Do you have a follow-up, Michelle?
No, that's good, thanks.
I want to do one last pass in person.
Janet again from the CBC. I just wanted to follow up on something you said, which is that you wanted to take the time to do this review of eligibility requirements properly. What are the other barriers you're aware of for eligibility for PDD?
For PDD, well, there's the disability by 18. Obviously, there are some issues with that. There are also assessment pieces that are not very transparent. So successive governments or successive bureaucracies, for lack of a better word, have brought in different assessment tools, and that determines the level of assistance you need in different independent living skills or living skills areas. And we don't always know what those assessment tools are like and how they're scored and how decisions are made. So I think that we thought we needed to consult on what kind of assessment tools are being used, who's creating those assessment tools, and what do they really assess. We've seen previous problems of assessment tools that were awful. I can remember one from like 2014 that was called the Supports Intensity Scale. That was just a disaster, and it was really embarrassing for people to go through. It was just horrible. But one of the things that we really needed to consult on is how are you getting to that decision using sort of anecdotal information in an assessment tool.
Our next question goes to Bob Weber. Go ahead, Bob. Your line should be open.
Hello. It's open, I hope? Yep.
Yep.
Okay. The case we've been talking about this morning involves autism. Can you tell me what other conditions this intelligence parameter applies to?
Sure. So anybody applying for persons with developmental disabilities, which is PDD, which pays for staff support, anybody applying for this has to be assessed, well, not everybody, some people can't do the test, but anyone that can do the test must get an IQ score. And so this would apply to all disabilities, all developmental disabilities, everybody on the autism spectrum that's applying, FASD, any kind of disability that is developmental or intellectual. So it applies to everybody.
Follow up, Bob?
No, that's good. Thank you.
And one last pass for questions in person. All right, with that, we'll wrap today. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.